Sixth, seeing the greatest part of ministers not only were defective in preaching against the acts of the rulers for the overthrowing religion, but hindered others also who were willing, and censured some that did it, and have voted for acceptation of that liberty founded upon and given by virtue of that blasphemously arrogant and usurped power, and appeared before their courts to accept of it, and to be enacted and authorized their ministers, whereby they have become the ministers of men, and bound to be answerable to them as they will, and have preached for the lawfulness of paying that tribute, declared to be imposed for the bearing down of the true worship of God, and advised poor prisoners to subscribe that bond, which, if it were universally subscribed, they should close that door which the Lord hath made use of in all the churches of Europe, for casting off the yoke of the whore, and stop all regress of men, when once brought under tyranny, to recover their liberty again. They declare they neither can nor will hear them, etc., nor any who encouraged and strengthened their hands and pleaded for them, and trafficked for union with them. Seventh, that they are for a standing gospel ministry, rightly chosen and rightly ordained, and that none shall take upon them the preaching of the word, etc., unless called and ordained thereunto. And whereas separation might be imputed to them, they resell both the malice and the ignorance of that calumny. For if there be a separation, it must be where the change is. And that was not to be found in them, who were not separating from the communion of the true church, nor setting up a new ministry, but cleaving to the same ministers and ordinances that formerly they followed, when others have fled to new ways. And a new authority, which is like the old piece in the new garment. Eighth, that they shall defend themselves in their civil, natural, and divine rights and liberties. And if any assault them, they shall look on it as declaring a war, and take all advantages that one enemy does of another, but trouble and injure none but those that injure them." Unquote. This is the compend of that paper, which the enemies seized and published, while it was only in a rude draft, and not polished, digested, nor consulted by the rest of the community. Yet, whether or not it was for their advantage so to blaze their own baseness in that paper truly represented, I leave it to the reader to judge. Or, if they did not thereby proclaim their own tyranny and the innocency and honesty of that people, whom thereby they were seeking to make odious, but in effect inviting all lovers of religion and liberty to sympathize with them in their difficulties and distresses there discovered. However, that poor party continued together in a posture of defense, without the concurrence or countenance of their covenanted brethren, who stayed at home, and left both them to be murdered and their testimony to be trampled upon, until the 22nd of July, 1680. Upon the which day they were attacked at Erasmus by a strong party of about 120 horse, well armed, while they were but 23 horse and 40 foot at most, and so fighting valiantly were at length routed, not without their adversaries' testimony of their being resolute men. Several of Zion's precious mourners and faithful witnesses of Christ were killed, and among the rest, that faithful minister of Christ, Mr. Richard Cameron, sealed and fulfilled his testimony with his blood. And with others, the valiant and much honored gentleman, David Haxton of Rathlet, was, after many received wounds, apprehended, brought into Edinburgh, and there, resolutely adhering to the testimony and disowning the authority of the king and council and all their tyrannical judicatories, was cruelly murdered, but countenanced eminently of the Lord. Now remained Mr. Donald Cargill, deprived of his faithful colleague, destitute of his brethren's concurrence, but not of the Lord's counsel and conduct, by which he was prompted and helped to prosecute the testimony against the universal apostasy of the church and nation, tyranny of enemies, backsliding of friends, and all the wrongs done to his master on all hands. And considering in the zeal of God and sense of his holy jealousy, provoked and threatened wrath against the land for the sins especially of rulers who had arrived to the height of heaven-daring insolence in all wickedness, in which they were still growing and going on without control, that notwithstanding of all the testimonies given against them by public preachings, protestations, and declarations, remonstrating their tyranny and disowning their authority, yet not only did they still persist in their sins and scandals, to make the Lord's fierce anger to break forth into a flame, but were also owned by professors not only as malignants, but as members of the Christian and Protestant Church, and that, however both the defensive arms of men had been used against them, and the Christian arms of prayer, and the ministerial weapon of preaching, yet that of ecclesiastical censure had not been authoritatively exerted against them. Therefore, that no weapon which Christ allows his servants under his standard to manage against his enemies might be wanting. Though he could not obtain the concurrence of his brethren to strengthen the solemnity and formality of the action, yet he did not judge that defect in his broken case, in this broken case of the church, could disable his authority, nor demur the duty, but that he might and ought to proceed to excommunication. And accordingly, in September 1680, at the Torwood, he excommunicated some of the most scandalous and principal promoters and abettors of this conspiracy against Christ, as formally as the present case could admit. After sermon upon Ezekiel 21, verses 25, 26, 27, quote, "And thou profane, wicked prince of Israel, whose day is come," unquote, he had a short and pertinent discourse on the nature and subject, the causes, and the ends of excommunication in general, and then declared that he was not led out of any private spirit or passion to this action, but constrained by conscience of duty and zeal to God to stigmatize with this brand and wound with the sword of the Lord these enemies of God that had so apostatized, rebelled against, mocked, despised, and defied our Lord, and to declare against them, as they are none of his, to be none of ours. The persons excommunicated and the sentence against them was given forth as follows, quote, "I, being a minister of Jesus Christ, and having authority and power from him, do in his name and by his Spirit excommunicate, cast out of the true church, and deliver up to Satan Charles II, King," etc. unquote. The sentence was founded on these grounds and declared in the pronunciation thereof, quote, "First, for his high mocking of God, in that after he had acknowledged his own sins, his father's sins, his mother's idolatry, yet he had gone on more avowedly in the same than all before. Secondly, for his great perjury in breaking and burning the covenant. Thirdly, for his rescinding all laws for establishing the Reformation and enacting laws contrary thereunto. Fourthly, for the commanding of armies to destroy the Lord's people. Fifthly, for his being an enemy to true Protestants and helper of the Papists, and hindering the execution of just laws against them. Sixthly, for his granting remissions and pardons for murderers, which is in the power of no king to do, being expressly contrary to the law of God. Seventhly, for his adulteries, and dissembling with God and man," unquote. Next, by the same authority, and in the same name, he excommunicated James, Duke of York, for his idolatry and setting up in Scotland to defile the land, and enticing and encouraging others to do it, not mentioning any other sins, but what he scandalously persisted in Scotland, etc. With several other rotten, malignant enemies on whom the Lord hath ratified that sentence since, very remarkably, whose sins and punishments both may be read more visible in the providences of time than I can record them. But about this time, when amidst all the abounding defections and divisions of that dark and dismal hour of temptation, some in zeal for the cause were endeavoring to keep up the testimony of the day, in an abstraction from complying ministers, others were left, in holy judgment, to be a stumbling block to the generation hardening them in their defections, and to be a beacon to the most zealous to keep off from all unwarrantable excesses, to fall into fearful extravagancies and delirious and damnable delusions, being overdriven with ignorant and blind zeal into untrodden paths which led them into a labyrinth of darkness. When as they were stumbled at many ministers' unfaithfulness, so through the deceit of Satan and the hypocrisy of his instruments, they came to be offended at Mr. Cargill's faithfulness, who spared neither left-hand declensions nor right-hand extremes, and left him and all the ministers, not only disowning all communion with those that were not of their way, but execrating and cursing them, and kept themselves in desert places from all company, where they persisted prodigiously in fastings and singing psalms, pretending to wonderful raptures and enthusiasms. And in fine, J. Gibb, with 4 more of them, came to that height of blasphemy that they burnt the Bible and confession of faith. These were the, quote, sweet singers, unquote, as they were called, led away into these delusions by that impostor and sorcerer, John Gibb, who never increased to such a number as was then feared and reported, being within 30, and the most part women, all which for the most part have been through mercy reclaimed from that destructive way, which through grace the reproached remnant, adhering to the foresaid testimony, had always an abhorrence of. Wherefore that ignorant and impudent calumny of their comfortship with Gibbs' followers is only the vent of a viperous envy. For they were the first that discovered them, and whose pains the Lord blessed in reclaiming them, and were always so far from partaking with them that to this day these that have come off from that way, and have offered the confession of their scandal, do still complain of their over-rigid severity in not admitting them to their select fellowships. To which may be added this undeniable demonstration that whereas the persecuting courts of Inquisition did always extend the utmost severity against the owners of this testimony, yet they spared them, and the Duke of York, then in Scotland, was so well pleased with Gibbs' blasphemies that he favoured him extraordinarily, and freely dismissed him. This was a cloudy and dark day, but not without a burning and shining light, as long as that faithful minister of Christ, Mr. Donald Cargill, was following the work of the Lord, who shortly after this finished his testimony, being apprehended with two other faithful and zealous witnesses of Christ, Mr. Walter Smith and Mr. James Boob, who, with two more, were altogether at Edinburgh, 27th of July, 1681, crowned with the glory of martyrdom. Then came the day of the remnant's vexation, trouble, darkness, and dimness of anguish, wherein whoso looked unto the land could see nothing but darkness and sorrow, and the light darkened in the heavens thereof, wherein neither star nor sun appeared for many days. And poor people were made to grope for the wall like the blind, and to stumble in noonday as in the night. While the persecution advanced, on the one hand, a violent spate of defection carried down the most part of ministers and professors before it, driving them to courses of sinful and scandalous conformings with the time's corruptions, compeerings before their courts, complyings with their commands, paying of their cesses and other exactions, taking of their oaths and bonds, and countenancing their prelatical church services, which they were ashamed to do before. And thereupon, on the other hand, the divisions and confusions were augmented, and poor people that desired to cleave to the testimony were more and more offended and stumbled at the ministers, who either left the land in that clamant call of the people's necessity, or lurked in their own retirements and declined the duty of that day, leaving people to determine themselves in all their perplexities as a prey to all temptations. But the tender pastor and shepherd of Israel, who leads the blind in the way they know not, did not forsake a remnant in that hour of temptation, who kept the word of his patience. And as he helped those that fell into the hand of enemies to witness a good confession, so he strengthened the zeal of the remaining contenders against all the machinations of adversaries to crush it, and all the methods of backsliding professors to quench it.